Welcome to the Cognitive Crucible, produced by the Information Professionals Association. Our website is information-professionals.org, where you can find links and information about today's conversation and get access to members-only content. Join John Bicknell and explore all aspects of our generational challenge, cognitive security. The Cognitive Crucible is a forum that presents different perspectives and emerging thought leadership related to the information environment. The opinions expressed by guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of or endorsement by the Information Professionals Association.
My guest today on the Cognitive Crucible is Dr. Jill Goldenziel, who is a professor at the National Defense University College of Information and Cyberspace. She's also a speaker, consultant, and arbitrator. At NDU-CIC, she teaches courses in international and constitutional law, leadership, strategy, lawfare, and information warfare to senior civilian and military leaders from the United States and allied and partner nations. Jill Goldenziel, welcome to the Cognitive Crucible.
Thanks, John. Thanks for having me.
And before we begin, I would just like to inform our audience that Dr. Goldenziel's opinions do not represent the opinions of National Defense University, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. So the conversation I'd like to have with you today, Jill, will cover China and the Philippines, and with a big healthy dose of lawfare as one of the overarching touch points there, I would think. But before we get into these topics, could we start, please, by just getting your overall general comment about the strategic landscape that we are in right now?
Sure. So obviously the bear that makes most professionals within the Department of Defense unable to sleep at night is China, and our really complicated relationship with China, plus the possibility of kinetic conflict in the Indo-Pacific region, which would be something we would all like to avoid. Incredibly bloody, incredibly difficult, and involving incredible casualties on both sides. And the way I have heard our relationship with China described by a mentor of mine is it's like the US and China are trapped in a bad marriage. We don't like each other very much most of the time, but we're really too intertwined at this point to be able to divorce completely. We, particularly economically, since they're our largest trading partner. But right now, what I'm seeing is China getting a lot more aggressive economically in terms of the types of requirements they're putting on our businesses, requiring Western firms to have Chinese Communist Party cells, saying they're going to block the sale of TikTok if it comes to that. And we're also seeing China being more aggressive against our allies, like Taiwan, certainly the Philippines and the South China Sea, which I know we're going to talk a lot more about today. And the US is really in a conundrum. What do we do in order to fulfill our treaty commitments to our allies and our legal commitments to our allies, when at the same time, we don't want to have war? And it's a extremely difficult position to be in.
Yeah. I came across your work, Jill, by reading a recent article that you put out, and we'll have a link to this in the show notes, and it's called "The Truth About the Philippines' New Strategy Against China." This is not the first time that you've written about the INDOPACOM region and lawfare by a long stretch. But what motivated you to write this most recent article?
Sure. When I learned about the Philippine Coast Guard's new strategy of transparency, it immediately hit home for me because it seemed to reflect my own ideas about what I call information lawfare, which is using law to bolster the legitimacy of one's own actions or to delegitimize an adversaries. And the Philippine Coast Guard's transparency strategy has involved really publicizing China's aggressive actions in the South China Sea, or what they call the West Philippine Sea, which is the part of the South China Sea that covers the Philippines exclusive economic zone. So China's aggression there is nothing new. China has been blocking Philippine vessels from traditional fishing grounds, blocking resupplies or getting in the way of resupplies of a ship called the Sierra Madre, which is a former US Navy vessel that the Philippines grounded in 1999 in order to cement their claim to an area called the Second Thomas Shoal. China's been putting in massive numbers of fishing vessels in order to harass Philippine areas, Philippine fishermen, and stake their claim to territory. This has been going on for years, at least since it really came to a head in 2012, but it's really been going on since sometime in the mid to late 2000s, I believe, if not before. But the Philippine government, particularly under the last administration, really kept this quiet when it happened. Didn't always speak about it publicly, tried to keep it out of the news, really kept if they responded to it diplomatically, they kept it under wraps for the most part. And the Philippine Coast Guard under the current government, which was elected last May, has really taken an about face and allowed journalists on vessels and aircraft in order to be able to actually witness them being challenged by and harassed by Chinese vessels or maritime militia vessels or Coast Guard vessels. And they have also really made a point of putting in the news all kinds of incidents, from minor incidents to involving harassment, but not any kind of contact or use of force, to the more major incidents where a vessel was involved in a very dangerous maneuver where the Chinese vessels actually blocked the Sierra Madre resupply in a near collision. So they're putting that information out there like never before. They've been very explicit about the strategy. And one of the reasons they've said for the strategy is we've got to expose the illegality of what China is doing. We've got to create a coalition of like-minded nations who believe in the rule of law and are going to rebuke China for their actions in this area. If we don't challenge them, then really by you can think of it as adverse possession, which is roughly the saying that possession is 9/10 of the law, or fait accompli. This is going to become China's going to be able to claim that they have this area. So what we need to be doing is exposing the illegitimacy of it. And in the way that they've done it in the press, it hasn't always involved law. It's just that it's wrong. But I've seen law there, and I thought, wow, this is an example of my idea. And to the extent that they're not actually using law, well, I think they need to be. So that's what I was arguing in my article, that this is their transparency strategy is an example of information lawfare, except law, it'll be that much more powerful if law were even more of a part of it.
I see. So, well, thanks for that recap. So, China famously has its three warfares. That's media warfare, psychological warfare, and legal warfare. Um, is it possible for you to quickly contrast like China's brand, if you will, of legal warfare? Like, what are the tactics that they tend to employ, and compare that to what you've been observing with the Philippines, or what you might suggest the Philippines do, because you said that you would recommend that they do more in the legal warfare realm.
Sure.
Does that question make sense?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So China's three warfares have underpinned its military strategy really since 1963 or even before that. Political warfare has also been a part of their military strategy. So whereas information operations is relatively new for us, not necessarily new new to be doing, but new as we've conceived of it as a function of warfighting. For China, it has been a function of warfighting really since for many years. And really they see it as underlying their whole military strategy, not just something separate that needs to be added. I mean, I've heard sprinkle a little information on it. They're not sprinkling. It is
Yeah, it's
it is
integrated.
foundational.
Yeah.
So um and these three warfares are meant to be used in tandem with each other as part of influence operations, but that they are seen as equally, legal warfare is seen as equal and equivalent to combat. So it's not, again, something separate, something supplementary, because if it's done right, you can achieve the same goal with it. So, three warfares: media warfare or public opinion warfare, roughly equivalent to what we think of as information operations, influencing public opinion in China's favor. Psychological warfare, roughly what we think of as psychological warfare, but a little bit different because it is more targeted at decision makers. It is designed to get an adversary to factionalize in some way. So we've seen examples of this with disinformation. We think about it more in terms of Russian disinformation, but designed to factionalize society in some way. Exploiting cleavages in society would be part of that. And then legal warfare, which is using law, domestic and international law, to support and legitimize what the PRC is doing or delegitimize what an adversary is doing and shape the legal environment in the PRC's favor, make it favorable to PRC actions. And so we haven't had until recently, I would say, and needs to be still more developed, but anything similar to this in US military. We don't have doctrine. We do have a program out of INDOPACOM. INDOPACOM now has a counter lawfare program, which I'll get to. Um, but we hadn't had anything similar to this until very, very recently, and by which I mean a year ago, when has had this since 1963. And there's a lot more I think the US can be doing. There's more that the Philippines can be doing to counter it. So with Philippines transparency program, the Coast Guard's transparency program, I think this is a fantastic start. I think the Philippines need to be doing even more of that to showcase what China is doing and the illegality of it, and why this is a problem for not just the Philippines itself, but for the international order overall, and all of the countries certainly that have a stake in the South China Sea, which is just about everybody, considering the amount of trade that goes through there and the amount of natural resources that lie within it, and the amount of fish stocks that are being depleted and really threatening the global fish supply as well. And then the Philippines, very famously in 2016, won a massive international arbitration against China, which defined the legal, what the features are in the South China Sea. Are they islands? Are they rocks? Are they low tide elevations that have particular, that then generate particular maritime entitlements? And the Philippines can do more to really bang the drum on this and help enforce it as well. And they can work with partners and allies in particular to do so. They can continue developing their own maritime domain awareness, which is really understanding their own maritime claims, building awareness of their own maritime claims, patrolling their own maritime claims. And they have signed an agreement that would help us do this. It's still in staffing, and it's still in staffing in both the US and the Philippines as well, but that's certainly something that's coming. It can work on information lawfare in other domains as well. It can continue to identify areas and that the PRC is likely to exploit in the future and really get ahead of it. get ahead of it by creating their own facts on the ground, or being able to be on top of and identify them in the future. And it can work with other partners and allies. There are rumors of other lawsuits, which China is very afraid of, which we can talk about as well. But there are rumors of other lawsuits by partners and allies. There has been a code of conduct, an ASEAN code of conduct in the South China Sea that has been under negotiation for a very long time, that the Philippines can help lead in working on as well, which would get other nations on board in order to highlight the PRC's illegal behavior. So there's a lot.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you started touching on this towards the latter part of your response just there, but I wanted to ask you, famously in the world of disinformation, there's the saying, the truth is barely getting its shoes on when a lie has already traveled around the world. There's lots of different versions of that, but the truth is seems to usually be playing catch up, and once you get into that game, it's like you've already lost. And I was curious if that same it sounds like you're trying to counsel organizations to be more proactive in an information lawfare engagement rather than playing that game of catch up. Would you say that that's fair?
I would say that it's fair, but I would say that the truth got started and we just haven't done anything to help it move along. I mean, law is the language that states have agreed to speak. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea has been around since 1982, excuse me. It was ratified in the early 1990s, came into force, excuse me, in the early 1990s. Of course, the US is famously not a signatory, but which we can tell by the tone of my voice, I think is a mistake. But we follow most of it because it effectively is a codification of customary international law, which means it's been something that states have agreed to follow and felt obligated to follow for really centuries before that. And it's just a writing down of that. So it's been in existence. These rules have been in existence well before 1982 is the summary of that. And states have agreed to them. China is a signatory to UNCLOS, which they like to rub in our face and say that the US is not. So the truth, as states have agreed to it, is out there. And it's China that is engaging in interpretations of it that are not widely accepted. And our voice, the voice that I would say is of truth, but certainly the consensus of partners and allies and the United States, is not getting out there as loudly because we're just not doing it. This summer, when China claimed that it had, quote, jurisdiction over the entire Taiwan Strait, I Googled it, and the first 2 or 3 articles that I came up with were articles by Chinese scholars supporting this. And there was basically nothing stating the US's view. And I wrote something in response to that, and INDOPACOM did have a TAC aid, tactical aid, as part of their counter lawfare program that was a part of that. But this is a perfect example of what I mean. China is doing their best to really prepare that information landscape for their view of the world. And if it's out there and it's what people are reading, well, it's much more likely to be accepted than if the world is silent. And there's a law out there, yes, but it needs to be publicized like anything else for people to be able to understand it. People don't read treaties; they read statements.
Yeah, yeah.
I read treaties, but
Not on people's nightstand, I wouldn't think.
no, they read articles, they read diplomatic statements, and if if the law is not out there, it's not going to be accepted as authoritative.
Right. Um, need just like a short little background on asking you this question, Jill. So we had a episode a while back with a lady from NIST, the National Institute of Technologies and Standards, or Standards and Technologies, Elham Tabasi. And we've got another conversation coming up here in a couple of weeks with a gentleman to talk about international, technical standards, and in particular, China's the like long game plan that they have had to integrate themselves into technology standards bodies in order to help promote Chinese technologies, or the steal IP. And I, I I'm curious if you have observed, or it's been discovered that China has been doing analogous things on the legal side, where we're potentially at risk of, like, one day waking up to discover that, and I'm being a little bit dramatic here just for effect, but we wake up one day and, my goodness, China has now rewritten the international rules-based system in order to favor China. Are there any projects like that underway that you might be aware of from a legal vantage? Do you get what I'm asking?
I think so. So
Okay.
I think
Yeah,
I think that's
I
I
might
think
be asking it in a clumsy way, or in
no,
a way that doesn't, exactly resonate with the words people typically use. So,
I think that's China's goal. And I think they're going to have success? Well, no, not if we do it right, and it's not easy, but that's what they're moving towards. First of all, China is famous for playing the long game. So they're not going to rewrite UNCLOS and have states follow it in a parallel treaty. They're going to keep chipping away at it, or they're going to keep trying to use adverse possession, create facts on the ground such that it becomes almost irrelevant, and starts to look irrelevant. And they're going to keep using information in order to make this point. Get a little bit into how later. And they are in the private sector, they are engaging in some behavior that's very concerning. So they're what they're doing in the South China Sea is really just undermining UNCLOS with their behavior, and then advancing interpretations of the law that are not standard. They are building institutions to counter particularly Western dominated institutions, which I call institutional lawfare. So like the Asian Development Bank um, is was created in order to be a counter, say, to the World Bank, which has traditionally been dominated by the US. They are also in private sector contracts, like their Belt and Road Initiative contracts and other contracts. They're including clauses that say these cases or any disputes arising from these agreements can only be resolved in Chinese courts or under Chinese arbitration rules. And they've invested a lot of resources in creating court systems and building their court systems for these purposes. And I mean, I would, and so they're being decided really under Chinese law by Chinese judges, and guess who those courts are likely to decide in favor of. So I go farther than you, and I don't know if it's actually hyperbole when I call it China's quest for global legal domination. So so yes, it is what they're going for, trying to rewrite the rules in their favor.
mm. What was that example that you just brought up? It was a bank. What was the name of that bank?
Hmm. The Asian Development Bank is one, and then they have another as well.
And presumably, the Asian Development Bank would, the primary currency would be the RMB, and so that's just another way of them to get their currency to be the dominant global currency, or I mean that would be the long-term plan, I would assume.
I don't actually know about that particular bank, so I don't want to misspeak. My
Okay, okay.
guess would be the same, but there have been other instances recently, including their relations with Brazil. They decided to not have the dollar be their currency of choice, but the renminbi as well. So I'm certainly seeing that.
One of my areas of interest is space, and I can imagine. Well, I always, I mean, some people laugh, but I really do, seriously analogize the space domain with the maritime domain, and there's like literally a space race going on right now for this kind of like first mover kind of advantage, and planting a flag in the ground on the moon or asteroids or elsewhere, the Lagrange points in space, and the concern is that whoever gets a foothold gets to make the rules. I could imagine a world where if China is able to get to the key terrain in space and have great influence in how the spacefaring rules of the road are defined, then that can feed back into uh, earthly rules of the road, I would think, and it it starts becoming a I don't know, some kind of like a feedback looping system, which could be problematic. Have you and your colleagues ever thought about that kind of a dynamic?
Yes, certainly. And I mean, I think it's the space race is the same story we've always had. I mean, why were we so interested in getting to the moon faster than Russia? But we're really now running into a situation where space junk is an issue, given that space has gotten our orbit has gotten really crowded with junk from junk from past missions up there, and we really need to, as an international community, be working together. China has not been abiding by these industry standards in and safety standards, I would say, if not laws themselves, that have for their space junk all over the world. They've seen it fall in certainly in Philippine waters as well. I've written about that. So, and yes, in terms of quote unquote colonizing space or staking claims in space, putting the proverbial flag up there, I think that there is certainly concern of whose rules will apply. And if we can't agree on them in an international community, and if they're not followed, and enforcement in space is, I would think, would be incredibly difficult in many cases, we are going to run into similar conflicts up there that are going to have bearing for on disputes on land as well.
So I understand that INDOPACOM has a counter lawfare program. Could you tell our audience a little bit more about that?
Sure. So INDOPACOM's had a counter lawfare program for about a year now. They called a few months earlier than that and asked me to work on it with them. And it's counter lawfare because it's countering China's lawfare. And it has they adopted my definition of lawfare from my article "Law as a Battlefield: The U.S., China, and Global Escalation of Lawfare," and my types of lawfare in the article. Plus, they added a sixth called partnered lawfare, working with our partners and allies on lawfare. And partnered lawfare is one of the two focuses of the program, and the other is information lawfare. So they are very much on board and supporting this idea of publicizing the illegitimacy of China's actions and the legality and legitimacy of the US's actions together with partnered and allied nations. And they've been working with, I should say we have been working with JAGs from other countries as well, and interested academics from other countries as well on partnered lawfare to really get the word out about this. The core of the program are TAC aids, which are tactical aids, which are publicly available on INDOPACOM's JO6 Staff Judge Advocate's Office website. And what tech aids are talking points with legal analyses, effectively. And so you can find those on a lot of the critical legal issues facing the US right now. Who has jurisdiction over the Taiwan Strait, I've already mentioned. High altitude balloons, obviously a big issue recently with the Chinese spy balloon. What's going on with the resupply of the Sierra Madre conflict over the second Thomas Shoal that we've seen a lot in the news recently, and that the Philippines have certainly been publicizing. China's commitments to Ukraine that they've been violating. So you can read all about these, and they're meant to be used by everyone from journalists and academics to public affairs officers, judge advocates, in order to really be able to understand and ideally publicize the US side of the story as well.
While you were unpacking that, Jill, I just did a quick little Google search, and we'll put a link in the show notes. But yeah, there's like looks like a dozen or so different TAC aids, from air and maritime exclusion zones, high altitude balloons, non-standard intercepts, freedom of navigation and operations. Yeah, I hope that these appear to be like little nifty one to 5 page documents which unpack the issue, and I suppose give some talking points. Is that what they are?
Yes.
Yeah, awesome. Very nice. Yeah, so we'll have a link to that in the show notes. Very cool project for sure. Um, but before we wrap up, Jill, I wanted to zoom back out to the global view again. And are there any noteworthy things to say about other actors on the world stage who may be also deploying what you would bucket as lawfare or information lawfare, that would be something that you could touch on real quick for our audience?
Sure. Russia, for some time, has been a relatively sophisticated practitioner of lawfare, particularly information lawfare, but even, I would say, as much, if not more than that, institutional lawfare. So they create domestic laws to justify their actions, whether it's passportization in Ukraine, which is distributing Russian passports to people of Russian ethnicity and background within Ukraine and other countries, to the legal groundwork that they laid for the invasion of Ukraine, all the way up to really the last minute. You could see the trail within legislation that was proposed and then enacted in the Duma as well. Ukraine has fought back against this in a pretty incredible way. Ukraine's the only state I know of to have a state lawfare website, lawfare.gov.ua, for their lawfare project. And they have launched cases in all kinds of international courts, both public international courts and then private arbitration tribunals as well. So everywhere from the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, using brilliant novel arguments, to the International Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, and then these private arbitration tribunals for claims that were by Ukraine and Ukrainian state entities for expropriation of assets in the Donbass and in Crimea since 2014, that were taken effectively by the Russian occupation, or as a result of the Russian occupation. And they have gotten more states on board than ever before as interveners, or as who have referred the Ukraine's claim to the International Criminal Court, more interveners than ever at the, or who've expressed their intent to intervene at the International Court of Justice. And then the private arbitration tribunals they actually recover costs, which Russia has, or damages, which Russia is notoriously difficult to enforce against. And this is something that, to me, is fascinating because this will raise the total cost of war. And this hasn't been enough to deter Putin yet, obviously, but for the next guy, it's going to, I think, make them think twice. I mean, US Iran claims tribunal has been going on for, since the 80s, late 70s or early 80s. The US and Cuba are still involved in claims. So this is going to go on for decades. And the next person is going to say, all right, well, if this is going to cost me, hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars in the long run, well, maybe I'll think twice about invading a country. It's not over when I decide the war is over. These claims are going to go on forever.
Yeah. Wow. Well, what an interesting and important area that you are engaged in, and it it seems to me it's only growing in importance, especially as it sounds like this is a concept of engagement which is we're, we, and by we I mean free nations, are perhaps still grappling with this engagement methodology, right? This is not our it's not in our like long-term DNA as you're describing it is for China, part of their integrated three warfares. This is something that's still new, and presumably leaders that you're talking with are still grappling with how to develop engagement methodologies and actually doing it. So wow, what a space you're involved in here. If I may wrap up, Jill. So I always like to ask guests if they can offer a research question that a student might take a crack at to help advance our methodologies and understanding of these dynamics.
I think that what are the key lawfare issues involving the defense of Taiwan, and what would be a legal basis for defense of Taiwan or for potential invasion of Taiwan from the US and or PRC's perspective is really something important that we need to be thinking about right now. And there are a million different scenarios by which this could play out. Certainly depending on a lot of things, but whether Taiwan actually declares independence or not, and the US decides to recognize it, are both big ifs. So that changes the legal basis for it. So it's something I know I've been thinking about and grappling with.
So your question is understand better the various different scenarios that could unfold around Taiwan. Would that be an okay recap?
Legal basis for the defense of Taiwan.
The legal
And in
basis.
order to answer that question, you would have to go through a whole bunch of different scenarios.
I see. Yeah, awesome. And then finally, what is a good book or other online resource that you might recommend to our audience?
I'm reading right now Isaac Carden's China's Law of the Sea. And it is a fascinating, excellent, and thorough exploration of how China has interpreted the law of the sea, or in some cases, protested the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea as the US understands it, vis-a-vis all of its neighboring countries in the South China Sea region. And it's really well done.
Jill Goldenziel, thank you so much for being a guest on the Cognitive Crucible.
Thank you for having me.
The Cognitive Crucible is the only podcast dedicated to increasing interdisciplinary collaboration between information operations practitioners, scholars, and policymakers. To find out more about the Information Professionals Association, visit us at information-professionals.org. Please support our podcast by giving us a 5-star rating and leaving a review.